The story of the Bronze Age collapse begins in an age of confidence, an age when the great powers of the late Bronze world believed their systems were eternal. From Egypt to Anatolia, from Mesopotamia to the shores of the Aegean, kings ruled from thrones, supported by international trade, vast diplomatic networks, and the most sophisticated technologies humanity had yet created. Bronze, the alloy of tin and copper, was the lifeblood of their armies, their wealth, and their vision of order. For centuries, it seemed unshakable. The Hittites dominated the heart of Anatolia. Mycenaean kings ruled from fortified palaces stretching across the Greek mainland. The new kingdom of Egypt reached further than any pharaohs before them. Babylonian scribes copied knowledge from tablets centuries old, believing the wisdom of their world had already peaked. This was a time of interconnected civilizations, where merchants crossed seas, where letters traveled between kings calling each other brother, and where no one yet imagined everything could fall apart. But within a single human lifetime, perhaps even within a single generation, the entire system cracked, faltered, and then shattered. Palaces burned. Trade routes fell silent. Kingdoms disappeared from history. The Bronze Age, which had endured for over 1,000 years, came crashing down with a force so mysterious that historians still debate its causes more than 3 millennia later. To understand why, we must begin by stepping into the world before the collapse, into cities buzzing with scribes and craftsmen, where the scent of incense mixed with the metallic tang of bronze workshops, and where kings corresponded not only with their allies, but with their rivals. This was a world united not by peace, but by a delicate balance. Each kingdom depended on the others. Copper from Cyprus, shipped to the empires of the East. Tin from as far as Afghanistan, flowing toward ports on the Mediterranean. Grain from Egypt, feeding merchant fleets carrying goods to Mycenaean harbors. Luxury items, lapis, gold, ivory, circulated among elites whose palaces glittered with wealth. Every link in this chain relied on another, and the chain was stretched tight across thousands of kilometers. Yet beneath the polished surface of this golden age lurked fragility. In the palace archives of Ugarit, one of the last cities to fall, we find desperate letters written on clay tablets, their edges scorched by the fires that consumed the city. In one, a merchant warns that trade ships have stopped arriving. In another, a general pleads for grain as famine grips the land. In a final tablet, the king himself begs neighboring powers for help, declaring that enemies have appeared in vast numbers and that his cities have no defenders left. The message was never delivered. The city fell shortly afterward, abandoned to ruin. The collapse was not a single event. It was a cascade, a falling row of dominoes where each toppled kingdom accelerated the destruction of the next. And somewhere in that chain reaction emerged the most famous specter of the era: the Sea Peoples. Warriors of mysterious origin, they attacked ports and kingdoms from Anatolia to Egypt, leaving devastation in their wake. But were they the cause, or merely another symptom of a world already breaking? To answer this, we must imagine life across the landscape of the late Bronze Age in the decades before the collapse. Farmers in the Hittite highlands struggled with drought that shriveled grain and left livestock grazing on barren earth. Mycenaean warriors returned from distant expeditions, bearing tales of unrest, of small villages fleeing inland, of minor kingdoms weakening, of old boundaries becoming unstable. Egyptian scribes documented fluctuations in the Nile flood, noting years where the waters rose too low to nourish the soil. Travelers across the eastern Mediterranean reported failed harvests, injured trade networks, and growing anxiety among those who depended on long-distance exchange. In the palaces, rulers ignored the subtle tremors. The system had survived famines before, invasions before, rebellions before. Why should this time be different? Yet history is rarely kind to those who fail to see the gathering storm. Somewhere in the web of trade, a great disruption occurred. Perhaps the tin routes through Central Asia faltered first. Perhaps drought struck northern Syria, forcing tribes to migrate southward. Perhaps rivalries intensified between kingdoms stretched thin by failing harvests. Whatever the spark, the result was unmistakable: the collapse of the trade network that supplied bronze. Without bronze, there was no military might. Without military strength, there was no protection. For merchants, without merchants, there was no food relief during drought, no copper shipments, no diplomatic gifts. Economic stagnation bled into political instability. And as the system weakened, groups of desperate peoples, some displaced by famine, others fleeing collapsing kingdoms, began to move. Some migrated peacefully, others turned to violence. Thus entered the Sea Peoples, not a single tribe, but a mosaic of displaced cultures, raiders, migrants, and mercenaries caught in the larger storm. They were carried by it. Archaeology reveals layers of destruction across the eastern Mediterranean, marking these years-burned cities. Toppled palace walls, charred workshops, smashed pottery. Yet just as striking is what appears after. Silence. No rebuilding. No return. No return. Entire urban centers that had stood for centuries were abandoned overnight. In Greece, the Mycenaean palaces Mycenae, Tiryns, Pylos fell one by one, leaving behind nothing but broken walls and stories whispered through the later myths of a dark age. The mighty Hittite empire fractured into isolated city-states, its capital Hattusa reduced to rubble. In Syria, Ugarit vanished so completely that it would not be rediscovered until modern times. Even Egypt, the lone survivor among the great powers, emerged weakened, scarred, and diminished, never again reaching the heights of the New Kingdom glory. But the question remains: why did the Bronze Age collapse? The answer is not a single cause, but a perfect storm. Climate change, famine, mass migration, political upheaval, the collapse of trade networks, invasions by displaced groups, internal rebellions, technological shifts that rendered old elites obsolete, and perhaps most importantly, the interdependence of the system itself. Each kingdom relied too heavily on others for essential resources, making the system efficient but catastrophically fragile. As the Bronze Age collapsed, new technologies emerged: ironworking, new forms of warfare, new cultural movements. Out of the ruins rose the Iron Age, a world shaped not by palaces and kings, but by smaller communities that rebuilt life from the foundations. It was a transformation violent, painful, and world-changing. Yet the ghosts of the Bronze Age still linger. In the quiet corridors of museums sit fragments of that forgotten world. Letters from desperate kings, weapons left on abandoned battlefields, pottery scorched by fires that ended dynasties. They are echoes of a world that believed it would last forever, and did not. And so we ask again, why did the Bronze Age collapse? Perhaps the truest answer is that no civilization, no matter how radiant, exists in isolation. When the web breaks, everything connected to it falls. The collapse did not arrive as a single blow, but as a creeping, almost imperceptible unraveling. It began on the edges of the great empires on the trade routes that threaded through mountains, deserts, and seas. These routes had functioned for centuries as the veins and arteries of the late Bronze Age. Their lifeblood was bronze, and bronze depended on the steady arrival of tin and copper. But sometime around the 13th century BCE, subtle disturbances began to ripple across these pathways. Caravans from the east arrived late or not at all. Merchants who once traveled the dusty mountain passes between Mesopotamia and Anatolia found themselves disrupted by bandits, border skirmishes, or local famines that forced entire regions into desperation. A caravan that might once have transported tin across hundreds of miles now risked ambush, starvation, or border closures by nervous rulers who feared shortages within their own realms. These early disturbances hardly seemed catastrophic at first. They were noted by scribes, mentioned in letters, or whispered among traders huddled in taverns along the Levantine coast. But each small disruption was a hairline fracture in the larger structure. Meanwhile, across the eastern Mediterranean, the climate was shifting in ways subtle but devastating. Tree ring data and sediment studies reveal centuries-old cycles of drought, but the period leading into the Bronze Age collapse shows a sustained aridification unprecedented in generations. Rains declined. Rivers shrank. Fields that once yielded abundant wheat and barley began to fail. Farmers stretched their stores thin, looking skyward for clouds that refused to come. In the highlands of Anatolia, where the Hittite farmers relied on early spring rains, the harvest began to falter. Herd animals grew lean, milk production dropped, and communities on the periphery of the empire began to feel hunger creeping in. Drought strikes hardest at the bottom. First, the villagers, the shepherds, the small communities scattered across the plains. But its effects ripple upward. As communities struggled, local unrest grew. Grain that once flowed to the palaces of Hattusa, Mycenae, and Ugarit became scarce. Tax caravans returned half empty. Officials begged the central government for relief, and kings, deeply invested in maintaining their image as providers of abundance, were pressured to act. Yet the drought was only the beginning. Hunger creates movement. Desperate families pack their belongings and leave their ancestral lands, searching for greener valleys, fuller rivers, safer places. These migrations ripple across entire regions, pushing other communities ahead of them like waves. Groups displaced from one land arrive in another, already strained by its own shortages. Tensions rise, conflicts ignite, and amid the chaos, the identity of refugees and raiders begins to blur. These were the conditions from which the Sea Peoples may have emerged. But to imagine the Sea Peoples only as raiders is to oversimplify their place in this grand unraveling. They were likely a mixture: farmers fleeing drought, warriors seeking plunder, clans driven from collapsing kingdoms, and opportunistic groups taking advantage of weakened borders. They moved not as a single army, but as a chain of migrations traveling by land and sea. Their reputation as invaders likely grew from encounters with kingdoms too weakened to repel them effectively. But before the great waves of attack recorded by Egyptian scribes, the collapse was already spreading. In the palace of Mycenae, palace scribes recorded inventories of bronze weapons, chariot parts, and armor pieces. Each item depended on the arrival of copper from Cyprus and tin from the east. But as trade faltered, the great workshops of the Mycenaean palaces struggled to maintain production. Spears dulled, armor pieces were reused instead of being newly forged. The warrior elites of the Aegean, once proud, lavishly equipped, and central to the palatial system, felt their power slipping. And when elite power becomes unstable, old rivalries often awaken. Some scholars argue that internal conflict played a critical role in the collapses that struck Greece. The massive fortifications built around Mycenaean palaces in the decades before their destruction suggest increasing tension and fear. Perhaps some palaces turned against one another. Perhaps internal rebellions ignited as resources dwindled. Perhaps the warrior class, once sustained by the palace system, rebelled when their privileges collapsed. Whatever the cause, the Greek mainland descended into fragmentation. Meanwhile, to the east, the Hittite Empire faced pressures from every direction. In the north, the Casca tribes, long enemies of the Hittites, took advantage of weakening central authority to push deeper into Hittite lands. In the west, rival kingdoms in western Anatolia rebelled or collapsed. In the east, Assyria was rising, pressing into lands the Hittites once controlled. A letter from Ugarit to the Hittite king captures the desperation of the moment. The author begs for grain shipments, reporting starvation and the collapse of local defenses. But the Hittites themselves were starving. The letter received no answer. And soon, Ugarit fell. But perhaps the most tragic evidence of the collapse lies in the city structures themselves. Archaeologists uncover layers of charred beams, collapsed roofs, and pottery shattered by intense heat. Clear signs of widespread destruction. But alongside these burn layers lies something even more telling. Signs of abandonment. Ruins that show no attempt at rebuilding. Streets left empty. Workrooms with tools frozen in time. Cities that were not conquered or burned, but simply walked away from by inhabitants with nothing left to sustain them. This pattern appears from Greece to Syria, from Anatolia to Cyprus. It is the haunting signature of systemic collapse. And as each city fell, the world became smaller. With every ruined palace, Another node in the international network vanished. Letters ceased. Trade routes darkened. Knowledge transmission slowed. Technologies stagnated. For the first time in centuries, kingdoms that had been defined by their interconnectedness found themselves isolated. In that isolation, old systems died, and from those ashes, new ones emerged. But the fall was not yet complete. For the collapse that destroyed the Bronze Age would strike its greatest and most famous battlefront along the shores of the Nile, where the last great power of the era made its final stand. And that moment, that clash between a dying empire and a wave of desperate, displaced peoples, would become one of the most iconic turning points in ancient history. To understand the final great struggle of the Late Bronze Age, we must turn to the Nile, to the heart of Egypt's new kingdom, as it confronted its greatest existential threat. For centuries, Egypt had stood as a pillar in the interconnected Bronze Age system, a kingdom of immense agricultural wealth, guarded by the natural barriers of desert, cataracts, and sea. While other kingdoms relied on fragile trade routes for survival, Egypt's lifeblood flowed from the annual inundation of the Nile, a cycle that made it one of the most stable empires in the ancient world. But even Egypt was not immune to the pressures building across the region. By the reign of Pharaoh Merneptah and later Ramesses III, Egypt's once mighty economic and military system had begun to strain. Inscriptions from this period speak of Libyan migrations pressing against Egypt's western frontier. These were not small raids, but large-scale movements of entire populations, families, warriors, herders seeking new lands as drought gripped the Sahara and North Africa. Egyptian texts emphasize that the Libyans brought their wives and children with them, evidence that these were not invaders in the traditional sense, but displaced peoples searching for survival. As Egypt battled waves of migrants in the west, rumblings began in the north. Reports filtered in through spies and merchants. Cities in Anatolia burning. Trade ships that once traveled regularly through Egyptian ports stopped arriving. Exotic goods, Cypriot, copper, Levantine timber, luxury items from the Aegean became rare. Egypt felt the network collapsing around it like a great circle of dominoes, each falling state weakening the next. And then came word of something larger. Vast confederations of peoples moving southward, along the coastlines of the Levant and across the Mediterranean Sea. They were described as fierce, determined, and relentless. They were armed, accompanied by wagons, families, livestock. These were not armies alone. They were entire nations on the move. The Egyptians called them the peoples of the sea. To the Egyptians, the sea peoples were not a mystery. They were a catastrophe rolling toward them like a storm. Reliefs carved on the walls of Ramesses III's mortuary temple tell of the chaos unfolding. Ships filled with warriors, their shields round, their helmets adorned with plumes, advancing in tight formations. These reliefs show battles fought on both land and water, a scale rarely depicted in Egyptian art. The pharaoh records that these peoples had already destroyed Hatti, the great Hittite empire, and had laid waste to kingdoms across the Levant. His inscriptions claim they left no land standing. Whether this was literal or rhetorical, it conveyed a brutal truth. The collapse had reached its crescendo. The decisive confrontation took place around 1177 BCE. Ramesses III prepared Egypt for total war. Defensive positions were fortified along the delta. Archers lined the banks of the Nile. The Egyptian navy positioned itself to intercept incoming fleets. When the sea peoples arrived in their boats, sleek, curved vessels powered by rows of oars, the Egyptians were ready. The ensuing battle was one of the most dramatic maritime confrontations of the ancient world. Egyptian ships maneuvered to trap the invaders in narrow channels, while archers fired relentless volleys from elevated platforms. The sea peoples, caught in a deadly crossfire, found their ships entangled and overturned. On land, Egypt met another wave of migrants in pitched battle, pushing them back with chariots and infantry. And unlike the Hittites, the Mycenaeans, or the kingdoms of Syria, Egypt survived, but its survival came at a cost. Egypt emerged, wounded, exhausted, economically strained, and unable to fully recover. The victory of Ramesses III did not reverse the collapse. It merely protected Egypt from meeting the same fate as its neighbors. In the decades that followed, Egyptian influence shrank dramatically. International trade dwindled. Monumental construction slowed. The empire retreated inward, beginning a long decline that would ultimately end its era of greatness. And yet, even as Egypt fought for its life, the world around it had already irrevocably changed. The Hittite Empire was gone, its capital abandoned to winds and wild grass. The Mycenaean palaces lay in ruins, their linear B records ending abruptly. Cyprus, once a center of copper production, descended into chaos. Its urban centers burned or deserted. Ugarit, the glittering trade hub of the Levant, vanished altogether. Its last letters, frozen in time, under layers of ash. But perhaps the most shocking part of this story is what vanished with these kingdoms. A vast corpus of knowledge, skill, and tradition accumulated over centuries. Bronze working techniques, palace administration systems, scribal education, complex diplomatic networks, standardized weights and measures, all of it disappeared in a matter of decades. The interconnected world that defined the late Bronze Age collapsed so thoroughly that many skills and technologies had to be rediscovered centuries later. In the aftermath, small communities became the centers of survival. Writing systems disappeared in many regions, giving way to centuries-long gaps in recorded history. This was not merely a political collapse, it was a civilizational reset. Yet, from the darkness, new developments began to stir. As bronze became scarce, societies turned to iron. It was harder to forge, but far more abundant. In time, it would revolutionize warfare, agriculture, and society itself. Peoples who had been peripheral during the Bronze Age, such as the early Israelites, the Philistines, the Arameans, and later the Phoenicians, rose in prominence. Greece entered a long dark age, but from it would eventually emerge the seeds of classical civilization. It is a reminder that collapse, however devastating, is not an ending, but a transformation. Messy, violent, and unpredictable. But to truly grasp why the Bronze Age collapsed, we must continue digging deeper into its economic fragility, its diplomatic interdependence, the fragility of palace-centric systems, and the human stories buried beneath the ruins. Because the collapse wasn't caused by one factor. It was the result of many forces striking simultaneously, each intensifying the others until the system broke. And in the next stage of our journey, we turn from the battlefield to the heart of the palace archives. From the thunder of war to the quiet desperation preserved in ancient letters, tablets, and records left behind by those who watched the world fall apart. If we walk now through the shattered corridors of the late Bronze Age, the most revealing clues are not found in burned walls or broken pottery, but in the words left behind etched into clay tablets by scribes who never imagined their world would vanish. These texts, found in palace archives from Hattusa to Ugarit, allow us to witness the collapse not from the distant viewpoint of archaeology, but through the eyes of people who lived through it. Their voices tell a story of fear, confusion. In the final days of Ugarit, scribes wrote frantically as the threat drew near. One letter, written on a tablet whose edges were scorched in the fires that consumed the city, is addressed to a high official abroad. The writer pleads for urgent military support. The enemy ships, he warns, are visible upon the horizon. The city is abandoned. Our fields are empty. As if the scribe himself was interrupted before he could finish. The tablet was found in the ruins of a building later swallowed by flames. In another letter, a merchant complains that the tin shipments have stopped arriving. Without tin, bronze production becomes impossible. Without bronze, the armies of Ugarit were left with aging weapons, cracked spearheads, dulled swords, shattered chariot fittings. Even the simplest tool in their workshops became precious, hoarded, repaired, reforged. Their world, once powered by an economy of metal, had been reduced to scarcity. A third letter is perhaps the most tragic. Amurapi writes with desperation, "My father, the enemy is upon my gates. My troops are away, my ships dispersed. The land is abandoned to itself. Please send reinforcements. His plea was never answered. Dot knows. Or perhaps it was, and the response never reached him. Either way, Ugarit fell shortly after, its final messages sealed beneath its own ashes. These letters reveal a pattern repeated across the entire eastern Mediterranean. The systems that held the world together were breaking, and in a world so interconnected, when one kingdom system failed, it dragged others down with it. Trade, once the engine of wealth and stability, became a liability. Cities that had flourished by exporting goods suddenly found themselves isolated. Workshops that once produced specialized items for international markets collapsed when their trade partners disappeared. Merchants who had grown wealthy on long-distance commerce watched their fleets vanish, their wealth evaporate, their status crumble, diplomatic relationships weakened. The Amarna letters, written centuries before the collapse, once detailed a vibrant, almost globalized network in which kings referred to each other as brother, exchanged gifts, and negotiated marriages. But during the final days of the Bronze Age, this network ceased to function. Messages were sent into a silent void. Scribes continued writing out of habit, not realizing that the recipients were already gone. Military alliances fractured. Armies, once supplied by vast agricultural and administrative systems, found themselves unable to muster soldiers. Records from the Hittite Empire mention shortages so severe that horses could not be fed, chariot units could not be maintained, and elite troops deserted their posts in search of food. Even religion, long the cultural backbone of Bronze Age civilization, began to shift. In times of crisis, temples that once received steady flows of grain, animals, and luxury goods suddenly found themselves begging for offerings. Their priests recorded omens, eclipses, strange weather patterns, sudden migrations that they interpreted as signs of divine displeasure. But the gods remained silent, and the palaces that had served as their earthly patrons crumbled. And beneath all of this lay the common people, the farmers, herders, artisans, and fishermen who endured the collapse most directly. For them, the crisis was not political, diplomatic, or strategic. It was personal. It was hunger. It was fear. It was waking up one morning to find the fields withered, the wells dry, the skies pitiless. It was packing everything one owned into a bundle and moving with one's family toward lands rumored to be more fertile. It was encountering other displaced families already on the move. It was being turned away at gates that no longer had enough supplies to admit newcomers. These were the realities that created the mass movements we now call the Sea Peoples. And yet, even as the collapse ground onward, not all regions suffered equally. Some communities adapted quickly. Some reinvented their ways of life. Some discovered opportunities in the chaos. Along the coast of the Levant, small groups learned to rely on maritime trade. Simple, local exchange that did not require the vast networks of old. These would eventually evolve into the Phoenician city-states, whose navigational skills would one day link the Mediterranean in a new era of exploration and commerce. In the highlands of Canaan, hilltop villages expanded rapidly during the collapse. They grew slowly, steadily, unnoticed by the great powers. These communities would eventually form the early roots of what would become ancient Israel. In the mountains of Syria and Mesopotamia, Aramean pastoralists expanded into territories vacated by collapsing states. Their language, Aramaic, would later become the lingua franca of the Near East for centuries, far outlasting the kingdoms that dominated the Bronze Age. These quiet transformations remind us that collapse is never total. It is not a single moment of destruction. It is a transition from one world to another, chaotic, uneven, and often misunderstood. But to understand the collapse fully, we must look not only at the grand movements of history, but at the lifelines of the Bronze Age that suddenly snapped. Food, trade, bronze, governance, climate, migration, war. All these threads intertwined, And as one frayed, the others weakened. The final collapse was not an explosion. It was a grinding, cumulative disintegration. And now, as we move deeper into the story, we shift our attention to the individual components that made the Late Bronze Age both brilliant and vulnerable to the economic systems that supported it, the technologies that empowered it, and the fragile balance that allowed it to flourish for centuries until the day it couldn't. To understand the fragility of the Late Bronze Age, we must first appreciate the astonishing sophistication that made it work. For centuries, the great kingdoms crafted an economic and administrative system woven together with precision. It was a world that could only function if every piece remained in balance. And it is in that very sophistication that we find the seeds of its eventual downfall. At the heart of this system was the palace. The palaces of the Late Bronze Age were not simply royal residences. They were the engine rooms of entire civilizations. In their workshops, artisans created objects both functional and beautiful. Intricate gold jewelry, carved ivories, chariot parts, ceremonial daggers, and painted pottery. Bureaucrats managed vast networks of taxation, redistribution, and labor. The palace was the marketplace, the bank, the government, the cathedral, the armory, and the university all in one. And the system worked. As long as the palace remained strong, the palace economies were redistributive. Farmers did not simply sell their harvests on an open market. Instead, the surplus was delivered to the palace, which then allocated resources to craftsmen, officials, soldiers, and priests. In return, the palace provided protection, employment, and stability. It was a system that kept cities running smoothly through centuries of prosperity. But it also created an enormous dependency. The absence of a strong merchant class, the lack of flexible markets, and the centralization of essential services meant that when the palace faltered, everything faltered with it. A drought that reduced harvests struck at the palace first. A disruption to trade crippled palace workshops. A rebellion could sever the flow of goods. An enemy raid could destroy the stores and archives that kept the entire bureaucracy functioning. And because so much authority and wealth rested behind palace walls, any shock, no matter how small, could spiral outward into a crisis. We see this clearly in the archaeological record. In Mycenaean Greece, palaces were surrounded by elaborate storerooms filled with pithoi, massive clay containers for storing grain, oil, wine, and other essentials. When the palaces fell, these storerooms were destroyed or abandoned. Without the palace, local communities lost access to distribution systems they relied on. Suddenly, villages had to fend for themselves, often for the first time in living memory. In Hattusa, the capital of the Hittite Empire, palatial archives reveal an administration stretched thin, constantly struggling to secure grain shipments from distant provinces. When pressure grew too great, when drought, invasion, and internal strife converged, the palace system simply ceased to function. Once that happened, the empire dissolved not over decades, but seemingly overnight. Even in Egypt, which survived the collapse, the palatial system was shaken. Ramesses III's reign shows clear signs of economic stress, labor strikes, corruption trials, and reduced temple offerings. While Egypt endured, it never again achieved the grandeur of its earlier New Kingdom height. All of this reveals a fundamental truth. The Late Bronze Age world was strong, but not resilient. It was prosperous, but not adaptable. And so the question emerges: why were these systems unable to adjust when confronted by crisis? Part of the answer lies in the very technology that defined the age: bronze. Bronze was the foundation of power. Armies used bronze-tipped spears, bronze swords, bronze-scaled armor, bronze chariot fittings. Farmers used bronze sickles to harvest crops. Craftsmen used bronze tools to carve wood, shape stone, and build ships. But bronze had an Achilles heel: it required tin. And tin was incredibly rare. There were no major tin deposits in the heartlands of the Great Bronze Age kingdoms. Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Levant, and most of Anatolia had little or none. Tin had to travel hundreds or even thousands of miles through long, perilous trade routes. It came from the mountains of Central Asia, from mines in Afghanistan, perhaps from distant sources in the Caucasus or beyond. It passed through the hands of merchants, caravans, diplomats, and middlemen, before finally reaching the workshops of the palaces. This created a system that was simultaneously globalized and fragile. If a caravan was disrupted, the flow stopped. If a kingdom along the trade route collapsed, the flow stopped. If war broke out, if bandits multiplied, if drought pushed tribes into migration, the flow stopped. And without tin, the Bronze Age could not continue. This helps explain why the collapse felt like a technological regression. But with tin supplies drying up, societies were forced to turn to iron despite its initial inferiority. Blacksmiths struggled for generations to perfect iron smelting and forging, yet eventually, iron's abundance made it a more democratic metal. Weapons and tools could be produced locally, without dependence on vast trade networks. It is almost poetic. The collapse of a globalized world gave rise to local autonomy and new technological horizons. But before this transformation could occur, the old world had to unravel completely. One by one, the major economic lines that sustained the Bronze Age snapped. Trade routes failed. Palace economies imploded. Specialist craftsmen lost their livelihoods. Scribes fled ruined cities, leaving archives to crumble under ash and time. The international community that once bound the great powers together dissolved into silence, and with the silence came isolation. For centuries, the Bronze Age world had been bound by communication, by letters carried across seas, by envoys moving between capitals, by caravans traveling long distances. When these channels closed, kingdoms found themselves cut off from their allies, their traders, their suppliers. They were alone, and in this isolation, many were unable to survive. Yet the collapse was not simply the sum of disasters. It was the moment when all these factors, climate change, famine, migration, warfare, technological upheaval, political instability, and systemic fragility combined in a destructive synergy. A perfect storm. And the most haunting truth is that no single factor alone could have ended the Bronze Age. It took all of them together. It took a world stretched to its limits, connected by threads so efficient yet so delicate that when they snapped everywhere. In the next segment, we will follow the chain of collapse as it unfolds, region by region, from Greece to Anatolia, from Syria to Egypt to Cyprus, watching how each kingdom fell, how each society unraveled, and how a world that believed itself eternal descended into darkness. To watch the collapse unfold region by region is to witness a slow-motion cataclysm, one that swept across continents with the inevitability of a tidal wave. Each region fell in its own way, for its own reasons. Yet all were connected by the same unraveling web. Let us begin in Greece, where the Mycenaean world, the land of mighty kings, towering citadels, and legendary warriors, stood first in line to face the approaching darkness. The Mycenaean palatial system had thrived for centuries. Cities like Mycenae, Pylos, Tiryns, and Thebes were more than mere settlements. They were centers of administration, production, and military might. They commanded territories, controlled trade routes, and collected goods from surrounding villages. Their kings, or wanaktes, ruled from megaron halls decorated with vibrant frescoes and supported by archives of linear B clay tablets. But beneath this grandeur lay instability. The Greek mainland was dotted with rival palaces, each competing for influence. Unlike Egypt or the Hittites, the Mycenaeans were not bound by a single imperial administration. They were independent kingdoms, united by shared culture, but divided by ambitions, rivalries, and fragile alliances. In the decades before the collapse, many palaces undertook massive building projects, strengthening walls, constructing storerooms, fortifying gateways. These defensive expansions suggest growing tension, whether from external threats or internal rivalry. Unease was mounting, even if its cause was not yet fully understood. Then, sometime around the end of the 13th century BCE, disaster struck. The palace of Pylos was the first to fall. Archaeological evidence shows the city was destroyed by fire, swift, consuming, unmistakable. Inside the ruins, the final linear B tablets record a desperate attempt to prepare for an attack. Scribes listed rowers to be gathered, watchers to be posted along the coast, defensive measures to be taken, but the preparation came too late. The attackers, whoever they were, left the palace a smoking husk. Next fell Mycenae itself. Its mighty cyclopean walls, so massive that later Greeks believed giants had built them, could not save the palace from destruction. Fire swept through its halls, collapsing roofs and blackening walls. The palace was rebuilt once, briefly, but then abandoned, never again reclaiming its role as the center of a Bronze Age kingdom. Terrans and Thebes met similar fates. The collapse was universal. Within a generation, the entire Mycenaean world was gone. What caused this destruction? Scholars still debate. Some argue for foreign invasion, perhaps by sea peoples or displaced groups. Others see signs of internal rebellion, a social uprising against the elite. Still others argue for a domino effect of economic collapse, where the failure of trade and harvests weakened palaces to the brink of ruin. In truth, the answer may be all of these at once, but regardless of cause, the result was unmistakable. Greece entered a centuries-long dark age. Writing disappeared. Monumental architecture ceased. Populations declined. Even the memory of the palatial world faded, becoming myth. When later Greeks spoke of the age of heroes of Agamemnon, Achilles, Odysseus, from Greece, the wave of collapse moved east to Anatolia, where the mighty Hittite Empire, one of the great superpowers of the Bronze Age, was quietly nearing its breaking point. The Hittites had built their empire on diplomacy, warfare, and a vast network of vassal states. Their kings ruled from Hattusa, a fortress city carved into the Anatolian highlands. Its walls snaked across rocky hills. Its gates were adorned with stone lions and warrior gods. Within its temples lay archives of cuneiform tablets documenting treaties, letters, laws, and myths. Yet even as the empire appeared strong, it was plagued by chronic vulnerability. Its agricultural lands were limited, dependent on rains that often fell irregularly. Its enemies, Casca tribes to the north, rival kingdoms to the west, and an ever-ambitious Assyria to the east, pressed at its borders. And like all Bronze Age powers, the Hittites relied heavily on trade for essential materials. By the reign of Suppiluliuma II, the last known Hittite king, the empire was staggering. Drought hit hard. Grain shipments from vassal states shrank or failed entirely. Letters from local governors complained of famine. Military campaigns became frequent and desperate. Internal disputes among nobles weakened unity. Then came the final blows. Attacks from migrating peoples, disruptions to trade, and internal rebellion combined in a fatal storm. Hattusa was abandoned, its gates left open to the wilds, its temples emptied, its archives forgotten. The once mighty capital crumbled into silence, reclaimed by nature over the centuries that followed. From Anatolia, the collapse swept southward into Syria and the Levant regions that had been among the wealthiest and most interconnected in the Bronze Age. Ugarit, the jewel of the Syrian coast, fell swiftly. Its merchants once commanded fleets. Its scribes wrote in multiple languages. Its warehouses overflowed with goods from across the Mediterranean. But when drought, trade collapse, and migratory invasions converged, Ugarit could not withstand the pressure. Other cities, Kadesh, Emar, Carchemish, suffered similar fates. Some were destroyed. Others dwindled into small settlements. The political landscape fractured. Regions that had been linked by diplomacy for centuries found themselves isolated and vulnerable. On Cyprus, the copper mines that fed the entire Bronze Age world went silent. Settlements burned. The island's complex trade networks collapsed. For decades, Cyprus flickered between partial abandonment and chaotic reorganization. Even Mesopotamia, long a cradle of civilization, experienced turmoil. While it did not collapse completely, the region was shaken by migrations, shifting powers, and the encroaching rise of Assyria and Babylon in the post-collapse world. And across all these lands, the same pattern repeated. A once cohesive world shattered into smaller, simpler, more localized societies. It was not simply a political collapse. It was cultural, technological, economic, and psychological. Entire ways of life ended. Literacy rates plummeted. Long-distance trade all but disappeared. The memory of diplomatic ties faded. The world contracted, turning inward. And then, after the collapse had run its course, a new world began, smaller, humbler, but full of potential. But before we explore the rebirth, we must first confront the deepest question of all. Was the collapse inevitable? Or was it the result of a series of preventable failures, a warning from the past about the vulnerabilities of complex, interconnected civilizations? In the next section, we turn to the heart of that question, examining the theories that seek to explain not only how the Bronze Age collapsed, but why it did so with such astonishing totality. To understand why the Bronze Age collapsed, we must journey inward into the structure of Bronze Age civilization itself. For centuries, the great kingdoms of this era lived in a world that was more interconnected, more interdependent, and more fragile than most ancient peoples ever realized. Their rise had been built upon alliances, trade routes, and materials that flowed like lifeblood across continents. Their fall, therefore, came from the unraveling of the very networks that had sustained them. One of the most significant factors was climate. For generations, the Eastern Mediterranean had enjoyed conditions favorable for agriculture. Stable rainfall, predictable seasons, and fertile soils that supported a population boom. But shortly before the collapse, something changed. Drought swept across the region, harsh, prolonged, and repeated. And cave sediments all point to the same conclusion. Rainfall dropped sharply. Crops failed. Rivers shrank. Pastures withered. Populations that had grown to depend on abundant harvests suddenly faced scarcity. And with scarcity came pressure. When a farming village loses its harvest, it suffers. But when a palace system loses its harvest, the entire structure trembles. They collected grain from the countryside and distributed it to laborers, soldiers, priests, and officials. The system worked until it didn't. When drought struck year after year, palaces found themselves unable to provide for their people. Bureaucrats recorded diminishing rations, temples pleaded for offerings, and the common people faced hunger. Worse still, these droughts likely displaced populations. Pastoral tribes, unable to sustain their herds, began migrating into settled lands, seeking water and fertile ground. The movement of these groups destabilized borders that had once been secure. In Egypt, inscriptions speak of foreigners, driven by hunger, pushing against the frontiers. In the Levant, cities were caught between defending their land and lacking the resources to do so. In Anatolia, the Hittites faced constant raids from northern tribes, raids that grew bolder as conditions worsened. Climate did not cause the collapse alone, but it set the stage. Another factor emerged from the complexity of the Bronze Age economy itself: disruption of trade. Bronze, the metal that defined the age, was not simple to produce. It required copper and tin, often obtained from distant lands. Tin, in particular, was rare. Much of the Near Eastern supply came from Central Asia, Anatolia, and perhaps even Europe. Without tin, bronze could not be made. Without bronze, weapons dulled, tools weakened, economies faltered. When trade routes failed, whether due to pirates, migrating tribes, or the very collapse of the cities that sustained them, bronze production declined. The technological foundation of the age crumbled. Palaces had built their wealth and armies on bronze. Now they faced shortages that forced them into technological and military retreat. Furthermore, the maritime trade routes of the late Bronze Age were intricate. Textiles, wine, oil, pottery, and luxury goods. Each port city depended on trade from the others. When one fell, the network weakened. When several fell, it collapsed entirely. Imagine a necklace made of many beads. Cut the string in just one place, and the beads scatter. The Bronze Age was that necklace, and the string snapped. Yet another factor was war, and not the small-scale raids or border skirmishes typical of earlier centuries. What struck the Bronze Age world in its final century was mass warfare. Invasions, migrations, and battles so large they overwhelmed traditional defenses. Egypt's inscriptions speak of the Sea Peoples, mysterious groups who arrived by ship and land, some fleeing famine, others seeking new territory. Their identities remain debated, but their impact is undeniable. They attacked Cyprus, the Levant, Anatolia, and even Egypt itself. They destroyed cities, disrupted trade, and contributed to chaos across the region. But the Sea Peoples were not the only military force reshaping the world. Internal rebellions likely erupted within some kingdoms. When palaces failed to feed their workers or defend their lands, resentment grew. A centralized government that cannot provide becomes a target. Palaces burn not only from outside attack, but from internal revolt. Peasants turned raiders. Displaced soldiers turned rebels. Regional factions vying for power. The complexity of the Bronze Age, once its strength, became its weakness. A complex system can withstand a single shock, but not 5 at once. Climate stress, trade breakdown, technological disruption, invasion, internal revolt. Each one chipped away at the great powers. Together, they toppled them. And yet, the collapse was not instantaneous. It took generations slow enough to be lived through, fast enough to be remembered as a cataclysm by those who survived. People must have sensed the world changing around them. Trade goods arriving late or not at all. Harvests shrinking. Palaces demanding more labor or more grain. Armies conscripting more men to defend weakening borders. Picture a merchant in Ugarit waiting for a copper shipment that never comes. A scribe in Hattusa recording empty storehouses. A farmer in Greece watching his crops fail for the 3rd year in a row. A mother in Cyprus gathering her children as raiders approach the coast. These were not abstract forces, they were lived experiences. The Bronze Age collapse was not a single moment. It was a generation-long unraveling, and it reshaped the ancient world. But to truly grasp its magnitude, we must look not only at the fall, but at what rose in its wake. For from the ashes of the Bronze Age emerged a new world, one defined by iron, by new peoples, and by new forms of government. A world that would give birth to classical Greece, to biblical Israel, to the Phoenician traders who spread letters and commerce across the Mediterranean. The collapse was an ending, but it was also a beginning. The collapse of the Bronze Age sent shockwaves across continents, but the effects did not stop at political borders or the ruins of palaces. The collapse seeped into the cultural memory of the ancient world, transforming myth, religion, migration patterns, and the very identity of peoples who survived the storm. To those who lived through it, the world must have felt as if the familiar order of things, the order their ancestors had relied upon for centuries, was dissolving beneath their feet. In Greece, the fall of the Mycenaean kingdoms left behind more than broken walls and abandoned citadels. It carved a wound so deep that it echoed into Greek mythology itself. The stories of the Trojan War, remembered in Homeric epics, bear the marks of a world unraveling. They speak of burning citadels, wandering heroes, displaced peoples, and kingdoms that once stood mighty but had fallen into ruin. It is no accident that the epics begin after the fall of Troy, as survivors wander a shattered world. It is no accident that Odysseus struggles to return to a homeland in turmoil. It is no accident that the gods themselves in Greek myth seem distant, fickle, and unpredictable, mirroring the instability of the age. The collapse became the soil from which Greek myth grew. But Greece was not the only region where memory and myth intertwined with destruction. In the Levant, oral traditions of displacement and migration influenced early Israelite narratives. The motif of wandering tribes, lost homelands, and destroyed cities echoes the demographic upheavals of the late 2nd millennium BCE. The Canaanite landscape that biblical authors later described: small hilltop villages, decentralized governance, new identities, was born directly out of the collapse. Meanwhile, farther west across the Mediterranean, the fall of Bronze Age powers opened the seas to new groups who had previously been overshadowed by the formidable navies of Egypt, Ugarit, and Cyprus. Among these were the Phoenicians. Before the collapse, Phoenician cities like Tyre and Sidon were participants in trade networks dominated by larger empires. But after those empires fell, the Phoenicians found themselves free almost by accident to fill the vacuum. They became the greatest seafarers of the Iron Age. They charted new routes, explored new coasts, and laid the foundations for a trade empire stretching from the Levant to Spain, from Cyprus to North Africa. The Phoenicians inherited a world of ashes and turned it into a world of opportunity. They perfected the alphabet, a writing system simple enough to spread quickly among merchants and sailors. The alphabet would eventually transform literacy, giving rise to Greek, Latin, Aramaic, and countless other scripts. The collapse of the Bronze Age did not silence the written word. It made writing more accessible. But while new cultures rose, others vanished entirely. In Anatolia, the Hittites ceased to exist as an empire. Their archives, their language, their diplomatic networks, all vanished. For centuries afterward, no one remembered that an empire had once ruled from Hattusa. It was only in the 19th and 20th centuries, through archaeological discoveries, that the Hittites returned to history. The Bronze Age collapse created a historical blind spot, a gap so large that entire civilizations disappeared from memory until modern times. Elsewhere, Egypt survived, but was fundamentally changed. The Ramesside pharaohs repelled the sea peoples, but the cost was immense. Egypt withdrew from its overseas territories. The great empire that had stretched from Sudan to Syria was reduced to a kingdom concerned only with its own borders. Its economy weakened, its bureaucracy grew corrupt, and its temples suffered decline. Though Egypt outlived its Bronze Age rivals, it did not emerge unscathed. The collapse marked the beginning of Egypt's long, slow fall from power. And in Mesopotamia, the great ancient powers Babylon, Assyria, Elam were shaken as well. Some survived, some adapted, others were consumed by new migrations and shifting alliances. The collapse did not spare even the most ancient cradles of civilization. But amidst this widespread destruction, a curious phenomenon occurred. Across the Mediterranean and Near East, people began moving into the highlands, hills, and remote regions, areas that had rarely been heavily populated during the height of the Palatial Age. Because the collapse destroyed the old order that had controlled the plains, valleys, and fertile lands. Without large states to govern them, without armies to patrol their borders, and without palaces to demand taxes or forced labor, people sought refuge in places that once had been marginal. Hilltop villages sprang up in Greece, Israel, Jordan, and Anatolia. These small communities relied on local resources, grew their own crops, raised goats and sheep, and built simple stone houses. There were no palaces, no monumental temples, no bronze workshops, only modest structures that reveal a life focused on survival. But from these humble villages came the seeds of new civilizations. In Greece, these communities eventually gave rise to the Archaic period, to classical city-states, and ultimately to the culture that shaped Western thought. In the Levant, small hilltop settlements coalesced into unique cultures, including early Israel and Judah. In Anatolia, new groups such as the Phrygians and Lydians emerged, eventually becoming powerful kingdoms in the Iron Age. The collapse destroyed the world of kings but created the world of peoples. It ended the age of palace economies and began the age of small communities, city-states, and tribal confederations. It ended centralized power but opened the door to innovation, independence, and reinvention. Still, to fully understand this turning point in human history, we must examine the deeper mechanism behind it, the fragility of complex systems. The Late Bronze Age was one of the most interconnected eras in antiquity, but that interconnection came with risks. When one kingdom fell, the shock rippled across the network. When several fell, the system could not compensate. Each collapse made the others worse. Complexity collapsed into simplicity. Empire collapsed into village. Bronze collapsed into iron. The world changed. Not in a single moment, but over a lifetime. And from that transformation, the foundations of the modern world would eventually emerge. To understand whether the collapse of the Bronze Age was inevitable, we must step back and examine the very architecture of the world that existed before it fell. The late 2nd millennium BCE was an age of unprecedented internationalism. The great powers, the Egyptians, Hittites, Mycenaeans, Minoans, Cypriots, Babylonians, and the merchants of Ugarit were bound to one another by a network of interlocking dependencies. At the heart of this network was trade, not casual trade, not the occasional exchange of luxuries, but a deep and systemic reliance on materials, goods, and resources that moved across hundreds of miles and countless borders. Tin from distant mines, timber from Lebanon, grain from Egypt, wool from Anatolia, silver from the Balkans, gold from Nubia, horses from northern plains, olive oil from Crete. Every region produced something essential. For centuries, this system worked, but it was a system balanced on a razor's edge. The palatial economies of the Bronze Age were not flexible. And like any complex machine, when even one essential component failed, the entire structure began to shudder. Imagine a palace administrator in the Hittite Empire preparing for the annual tribute of grain and livestock from a vassal state only to discover the harvest has failed. Without the grain, soldiers must go unpaid. Without soldiers, borders cannot be defended. Without defended borders, raids increase. Without trade caravans arriving safely, copper supplies dwindle. Without copper, bronze production falters. Without bronze, weapons rust and tools weaken. In this way, the sophisticated mechanisms of the Bronze Age worlds were both powerful and perilous. Each thread was tightly woven, but none could break without threatening the whole pattern. The collapse, once begun, fed on itself. It is easy to imagine leaders of the age believing in their own invincibility. They commanded sprawling territories and controlled the wealth of entire regions. They corresponded with one another as brothers, pharaohs, and great kings, exchanging gifts of gold, horses, and exotic animals. But beneath this glittering facade, survival depended on things none of them could fully control. Rainfall, trade winds, distant mines, the loyalty of vassals, the movements of nomads, and the unpredictable rhythms of a changing world. This fragility was most apparent in the letters exchanged between rulers. Clay tablets reveal a constant flow of pleas, negotiations, demands, and reassurances. Governors wrote frantically when shipments were late. Vassals begged for grain in times of famine. Kings accused one another of withholding materials or failing to honor treaties. These were not the messages of stable empires. They were the messages of states trying desperately to keep a delicate system afloat. And then, somewhere in the late 13th century BCE, the system crossed a threshold, a tipping point. The world was already stressed, but the stresses had not yet collided. What came next was a convergence of disasters so overlapping, so simultaneous, that no state could respond effectively. First came the climate shift drought that stretched across the Mediterranean basin. Not 1 year, not 2, but a long, debilitating period of dryness that shrank harvests and spread hunger. Farmers abandoned fields, herds dwindled, tribes migrated in search of greener land. Then came internal rebellions, local populations rising against their palace elites. When a palace could not provide food, could not protect its people, could not maintain its authority, loyalty crumbled. Some palaces were burned not by invaders, but by their own subjects. Then came the disruptions of trade. A single missing shipment of copper or tin could cascade into shortages that lasted years. Workshops closed. Artisans fled. Economies shrank. Maritime routes became dangerous, patrolled by pirates, or cut off entirely by the destruction of key ports. Then came war. Mass movements of people. Armies of unknown origin. Marauding bands that swept along the coastlines and inland routes. These were not organized imperial armies with supply lines and bureaucracies. These were desperate groups, fighting for land, food, or mere survival. The sea peoples were not a single tribe, they were a symptom of a world in flux. Each force amplified the others, until kingdoms found themselves overwhelmed. Some resisted valiantly. Egypt fought major battles to defend its delta. The Hittites attempted to stabilize their borders. The remaining Mycenaean kingdoms fortified cities with massive walls. But their efforts were reactive, not preventive. They were fighting the symptoms of systemic collapse, not the cause. And this is the haunting truth. Even if one factor had been mitigated, if drought had eased, if trade had resumed, if a single enemy had been defeated, the collapse might still have come. Because the Bronze Age world was too interconnected, too centralized, too specialized to survive multiple shocks. It was a world optimized for stability, not for change. A world built for prosperity, not for crisis. A world strong in appearance, but brittle at its core. And yet, this raises another question that is rarely asked. What of those who did not collapse? What of the societies that adapted, survived, or even prospered in the aftermath? Because while the collapse was devastating, it was not universal. Highland communities, smaller, decentralized, and less reliant on long-distance trade, suffered less. They grew their own crops, forged their own tools, and were accustomed to modest living. When the great kingdoms fell, these villages continued much as they always had. Nomadic and semi-nomadic groups who had never depended on palaces adapted more quickly. Their mobility, their independence from rigid bureaucracies, and their diverse subsistence strategies gave them flexibility that settled empires lacked. City-states that emerged later, like those of Phoenicia, did so precisely because their coastal trade networks could be rebuilt faster than inland agricultural systems could recover. These maritime cultures would become some of the most influential traders of the next era. And then there was Egypt, a state that survived, barely, by concentrating all its resources, tightening borders, and reorganizing its priorities. But even Egypt never fully recovered its former might. The collapse spared its life, but not its glory. What becomes clear is this. It was not random chance that determined who survived the Bronze Age collapse. It was structure. It was adaptability. It was decentralization. It was reliance or independence from fragile systems. The ancient world had unknowingly created a civilization vulnerable to cascading failure. When one piece fell, the rest followed. This was not merely a collapse of cities. It was a collapse of complexity. And from the rubble, a new form of civilization would rise, one tougher, more flexible, and shaped by the hard lessons of the age that had come before. As the old systems fell and the world's intricate web of palatial power unraveled, something profound began to take shape beneath the surface. Quietly, slowly, almost invisibly at first. Civilizations in the aftermath of the Bronze Age collapse were not merely rebuilding. They were redefining the very meaning of what society could be. It is easy to view the collapse as a dark age, a long shadow cast over centuries of progress, and indeed much was lost. Writing systems disappeared. International diplomacy ceased. Monumental architecture halted, and entire cultures vanished into oblivion. But a collapse is not simply an ending. It is a clearing of the stage, a resetting of the world, an open canvas upon which new ideas, new peoples, and new technologies can emerge. To see the new world forming, we must look more closely at the landscapes left behind. Imagine the ruins of a Mycenaean palace. Its once polished floors are cracked and covered with weeds. The frescoes that once depicted warriors, chariots, and gods flake away, revealing bare stone. The giant walls stand silent, their gates unguarded, their storerooms empty. The great Megaron Hall, where kings once held court beneath painted ceilings, is now a hollow echo. But look closer. Among the ruins, small clusters of humble houses begin to appear. Families building simple dwellings from the stones of the fallen palace. They raise goats, tend small fields, store food in clay jars, forge basic tools, and craft pottery without palatial supervision. There are no scribes here, no bureaucrats, no royal decrees. Life has become local, personal, and modest. These communities represent the first flickering lights of a new age, and they were not alone. Across the Levant, Anatolia, and the Aegean, similar patterns emerged. Old centers died, new centers slowly formed. In the absence of centralized authority, people began to govern themselves. Power dispersed into thousands of hands. Where once a handful of kings commanded empires, now hundreds of small groups made decisions for their own survival. In one sense, humanity had gone backward. In another, humanity had taken its first step toward a more distributed world. For centuries, ordinary people had lived under systems that controlled what they grew, what they produced, and what they owed to the palace. But now, with no palaces left to issue directives, autonomy was reborn not by choice, but by necessity. These small societies innovated because they had to. They learned to conserve resources. They learned to adapt to unpredictable harvests. They learned to work iron. They learned to survive without the safety net of empire. Something else was happening too. Something that would shape the entire arc of human history. The spread of new knowledge through new channels. Before the collapse, literacy had been the domain of palace scribes, trained in complex writing systems like Linear B or cuneiform. But with these palaces gone, those systems faded, and in their place, a simpler writing system began to spread the alphabet. Phoenician traders, navigating the Mediterranean in small but agile ships, carried with them not only goods, but ideas. Among them was an innovation so revolutionary that it would transform communication forever. A writing system composed of a small set of letters, each representing a sound. No thousands of signs, no years of training, no palace archives required. This technology, born in the Levant, would travel to Greece, where it evolved into the Greek alphabet. From there, it would shape Latin, and eventually, the alphabets used by billions today. Ironically, it was the collapse of the old world that allowed the written word to become accessible to the many, rather than reserved for the few. A similar pattern unfolded with technology. The scarcity of bronze forced communities to adopt iron, but iron also changed warfare. Bronze swords could bend or break. Iron swords, once the forging process improved, could be produced in greater quantities and withstand greater stress. This gave smaller groups the ability to defend themselves against larger, once dominant powers. The monopoly on weaponry that palaces once held evaporated. Power was shifting. Society was flattening. The age of kings was giving way to the age of peoples. But this transformation was not immediate. The recovery from the collapse took centuries. And for the first time in a long time, humanity experienced something that could almost be described as a common trauma. The old world had been interconnected, so too was its fall. And in that shared experience of collapse, the seeds of shared ideas were planted. Religions evolved, myths changed, art transformed, social structures diversified, new identities emerged. For example, in the highlands of Canaan, small groups began to form communities that would later coalesce into the early Israelites. In the Western Mediterranean, the collapse created a vacuum that allowed new cultures, Etruscans, Sicilians, Iberians, to develop distinct identities. In Anatolia, the Neo-Hittite states blended old traditions with new influences, forming a cultural bridge between the vanished Hittites and the rising kingdoms of the Iron Age. Even in regions that had been devastated, humanity found ways to rebuild. On Cyprus, New settlements appeared after the initial destruction. In the Aegean, Greek communities began to form what would eventually become city-states. Trade routes slowly reconnected, at first tentatively, then with growing confidence. By the 10th century BCE, the world was different, leaner, tougher, and infused with new ideas. Gone were the diplomatic letters written on clay tablets between great kings. Gone were the chariot armies that once thundered across the plains. Gone were the vast palace complexes that consumed resources from hundreds of villages. In their place stood a world of sailors, smiths, farmers, and traders. A world no longer dominated by a few giant empires, but by dozens of smaller, more flexible cultures. A world more adaptable to change, because it had been forged in the fires of catastrophe. And it is here out of devastation that some of the most important developments in human civilization would begin to take shape. But before exploring the rise of the Iron Age in full, we must dive deeper into one question that still fascinates scholars today. Did the Bronze Age collapse happen suddenly, or was it a slow erosion that took generations to fully unfold? To understand whether the Bronze Age collapse was sudden or slow, we must examine the rhythm of decline across the ancient world. History often portrays collapses as single events, catastrophic moments when everything shatters at once. But rarely is that true. Collapses are stories of accumulating stresses, building pressure, and systems strained until they finally break. Imagine the Eastern Mediterranean in the decades before 1200 BCE. On the surface, the great powers still appeared strong. Egypt stood tall under the Ramesside pharaohs. Mycenaean Greece remained dotted with palatial centers, and the Hittites ruled a vast empire from Hattusa. But beneath this veneer of stability, fault lines had already begun to form. Climate began shifting. Crops became unreliable. The cost of maintaining large palatial economies grew heavier. Populations rose, placing greater pressure on farmlands and trade networks. Small conflicts simmered along borders. Minor migrations increased. Raiders tested defenses. Trade ships reported shortages and rising prices. Letters between rulers grew more desperate. The world was not collapsing yet, but it was being stretched. Then came the tipping points. Some regions fell swiftly, as if the flame of civilization had been snuffed out in a single terrible night. Others suffered a slow unraveling, their decline measured in generations. Take Ugarit, for example. The city appears one day in its archives as a vibrant port with active trade letters, shipments, diplomatic exchanges. But within a short span, the tone shifts to panic. The final clay tablets record pleas for aid, warnings of enemy ships, and frantic messages arriving too late to save the city. But in Mycenaean Greece, the decline was more gradual. The first palaces fell around 1250 BCE. Others burned at least 50 years later. Even after the destruction, some regions held on, their cultures weakening slowly. Centuries would pass before Greece fully descended into its dark age. Meanwhile, the Hittite Empire experienced a collapse that was both sudden and slow. The capital, Hattusa, was destroyed in a dramatic blow, but only after decades of internal strain, rebellious vassals, grain shortages, and military defeats. The empire did not die in a moment. It bled out over time. This is the duality of the Bronze Age collapse. Swift in some places, gradual in others. A storm that arrived differently, depending on where you stood. And yet, even with these varied experiences, there is no doubt that by around 1177 BCE, within a single human lifetime, the world had been transformed. The interconnected system that had endured for centuries simply could not withstand the convergence of pressures. Empires had grown dependent on long-distance trade, tin from Afghanistan, copper from Cyprus, lumber from Lebanon, horses from Anatolia, grain from Egypt. The palatial economies were like machines that required every part functioning. Remove one piece, and the system could still survive. But remove several pieces at once, and the machine failed entirely. When climate stress reduced harvests, it created hunger. When hunger created unrest, It weakened governments. When weakened governments failed to protect trade, materials dried up. When materials dried up, armies and economies faltered. And when armies faltered, invaders and migrants had opportunities to push inward. One problem amplified the next. We can imagine this world like a great woven net spread across the eastern Mediterranean. Every city, every port, every palace, every kingdom was a knot in that net. As long as the knots held, the net remained strong. But once a few knots began to tear, the weight shifted. More knots strained. More strands snapped. Eventually, the net collapsed under its own interconnectedness. That is the deeper truth of this era. The very thing that made the Bronze Age great, its global integration, also made it vulnerable. This raises a profound question. If the Bronze Age was a system that depended on stability, what happened when instability became the new normal? The answer lies with the people, not the kings and generals highlighted in surviving records, but the millions of ordinary farmers, sailors, shepherds, metalsmiths, and merchants who lived through this upheaval. For them, the collapse was not an abstract geopolitical shift. It was a daily struggle, a shifting reality, a gradual recognition that the world they had known was fading and would not return. Imagine a farmer in Anatolia. The rains don't come. His barley yields half of what it once did. Local officials begin demanding extra grain to feed soldiers fighting distant wars. Trade caravans become rarer. Prices rise. Rumors of raiders spread through the villages. One year, he survives. The next, his family barely scrapes by. Then, soldiers stop arriving altogether. Local authority dissolves. Communities retreat into isolation. His world ends slowly. Not in a single moment. Across the sea, a merchant in the Levant faces similar struggles. But he hears of blocked routes, of ships that vanish along the coast. He watches his profits shrink until sailing becomes too dangerous. He closes his business. His livelihood collapses, not overnight, but through a steady tightening of circumstances. This was the lived experience of decline. And yet, despite the hardship, humanity persisted. What looks to us like collapse may have felt to them like transformation. Painful, yes. Destructive, certainly. But also a transition into something new. In some regions, society restructured itself into smaller, more flexible communities. In others, new leaders emerged. Warlords, chieftains, merchant captains, stepping into the vacuum left by fallen kings. And in this fluid world, cultures mixed, innovation spread, and new identities took shape. This fluidity is key. It is in these in-between centuries between the collapse of the Bronze Age and the rise of the Iron Age civilizations that the foundations were laid for the world that would follow. Phoenician trade networks, Greek city-states, the kingdoms of Israel and Judah, the Neo-Assyrians, and eventually, the great classical civilizations. But before we journey into this rebirth, we must explore one of the greatest mysteries of all. Who exactly were the so-called Sea Peoples? And what role did they truly play in the collapse? To understand the Sea Peoples, we must first acknowledge a striking truth. They remain one of the greatest enigmas of the ancient world. Their name was not their own, it was a label applied by Egyptian scribes who saw them arriving by land and sea in waves that broke violently against the borders of the Nile Delta. Their origins are debated, their intentions unclear, and their identity fragmented across inscriptions, ruins, and archaeological traces scattered from Anatolia to the Levant and deep into the Mediterranean. Yet despite these uncertainties, their impact on history is undeniable. To visualize the Sea Peoples, imagine the eastern Mediterranean, around 1200 BCE, not as a static map of kingdoms and empires, but as a vast sea of movement, of displaced peoples, of wandering families, of warriors seeking new lands, of migrants looking for safety from drought, famine, or war. Some may have been refugees, others were mercenaries, some were opportunistic raiders. Others were entire communities, uprooted by events beyond their control. The collapse was not the work of a single people, but the sea peoples became a symbol of the chaotic human tide that surged across the region. Let us begin with the first eyewitness accounts. Egyptian records, especially the inscriptions of Pharaoh Ramesses III, detail terrifying encounters with sea-borne invaders. They describe strange warriors with feathered headdresses, horned helmets, long swords, circular shields, and unique clothing styles. They arrived in ships unlike those of the Egyptians, sleek, narrow vessels optimized for speed and maneuverability. Ramesses III claimed victory, but the mere fact that Egypt recorded these battles shows how significant the threat was. But were the sea peoples responsible for the collapse, or were they a symptom of the collapse already underway? This is the question that has shaped a century of debate. Some scholars imagine them as terrifying marauders who swept through the region, destroying cities with fire and sword. Others argue that they represent a desperate mass migration triggered by environmental disaster, famine in the Aegean, drought in the Balkans, or volcanic activity elsewhere. Still others suggest they were displaced mercenaries whose employers, the Great Bronze Age kingdoms, could no longer pay them once economic systems began to crumble. The truth may lie in a combination of all these explanations. But what we do know is this: the sea peoples appear not in one place, but across a wide arc. The archaeological patterns show burned layers in cities from Anatolia down to Canaan and across the Aegean. And yet, not all destructions happened at the same time, nor do they all match the weapons or tactics of the sea peoples described by Egypt. In some cities, bodies lie unburied in the streets, signs of violent attack. In others, there is no sign of conflict at all, simply abandonment. In some places, fortifications were hastily reinforced, showing communities that prepared, but perhaps never faced invasion. In others, destruction was complete, leaving only scorched rubble. This patchwork suggests that the sea peoples were not a monolithic army, but a collection of groups moving for different reasons, united not by culture, but by circumstance. Their migration may have triggered destruction in some places, while merely taking advantage of chaos in others. And from this chaotic movement of peoples came new cultures. Among the groups listed in Egyptian accounts, certain names stand out. The Peliset, who many scholars associate with the Philistines. The Shurden, who appear earlier as mercenaries and later in distant lands. The Danyen, possibly connected to the Danaans of Greek tradition. And others whose identities are still uncertain. What is remarkable is that some of these groups did not vanish after their clashes with Egypt. They settled. The Peliset eventually established themselves in the southern Levant, giving rise to the Philistine culture known from later biblical texts. Their pottery shows Aegean influence, their architecture distinct from local styles, their diet unique, and their artistic motifs linking them to far-off homelands across the sea. This is one of the clearest legacies of the sea peoples. They were not just destroyers, they were founders. Their arrival reshaped coastal Canaan, altered trade routes, and introduced new artistic and technological influences. They created a hybrid culture, blending Aegean traditions with local Levantine customs, producing something entirely new. In other words, the sea peoples were not merely agents of destruction, they were carriers of transformation. And here lies the deeper truth. Mass migrations often follow collapses. When empires crumble and food sources fail, people move. They seek safety, fertile land, opportunities, and stability. The collapse of the Bronze Age was no exception. The sea peoples may have contributed to the destruction, but they were also reacting to it. They were a human response to a world in crisis. Many cities that fell during this era show signs of internal issues: rebellion, inequality, weakened leadership, failing economies long before any signs of invasion appear. This suggests that the sea peoples found an already fractured world, a world vulnerable to disruption, but their movements undoubtedly accelerated the collapse. As they swept along the coasts, trade routes became dangerous, merchant ships became targets, ports that once thrived on international exchange were abandoned or fortified. The very arteries of the Bronze Age, its sea lanes, became battlegrounds, and once the flow of materials stopped, the great palatial system starved. Bronze supplies dwindled, tin shipments ceased, copper mines were abandoned, bureaucracies broke down. Without trade, the economic foundations of kingdoms collapsed. This is how migrations, even without deliberate intent, can unravel civilizations. Yet, amid the chaos, a curious thing happened. Some cities survived. Some even prospered. Why? Because they adapted. While many mighty palaces collapsed, small port towns, agile trading communities, and flexible village networks survived. They relied less on centralized systems and more on local resilience. These survivors became the seeds of the Iron Age world. Among them were Phoenician cities like Byblos, Sidon, and Tyre. Their strong seafaring tradition allowed them to withstand disruptions and eventually dominate Mediterranean trade. In Greece, small settlements that endured the collapse later evolved into the iconic city-states: Athens, Sparta, Corinth, Thebes. In the Levant, new political landscapes formed, including the early Israelite and Aramaean kingdoms. In this way, the Sea Peoples were both an ending and a beginning, one of the final waves crashing against the Bronze Age shore, and one of the first forces shaping the new world to come. But as dramatic as their story was, they were only one thread in a much larger tapestry. To truly understand the collapse, we must now explore the environmental forces that shaped the era, forces that may have been more devastating than any army. If human migrations and warfare strained the Bronze Age world, then nature itself delivered the final, unrelenting pressure. For beneath the political turmoil and the collapse of trade networks, a larger force was reshaping the environment. A force silent, invisible, and indifferent to the ambitions of kings. To understand this force, we must imagine the climate of the late 13th and early 12th centuries BCE. For centuries, the eastern Mediterranean had enjoyed relative stability. Rainfall was predictable. Rivers flowed, farmlands flourished, surpluses grew. Empires expanded on the abundance of nature. But then something changed. Tree ring records, cave deposits, pollen samples, and sediment cores tell a consistent story. A prolonged drought spread across the entire region. Not a single dry season, or even a decade, but a multi-generational reduction in rainfall that lasted perhaps 150 years or more. The impact was catastrophic. In lands like the Levant and Anatolia, agriculture depended heavily on seasonal rains. When those rains weakened, harvests shrank. Fields once rich with barley and wheat turned brittle and yellow. Wells dried. Storage jars filled with grain emptied faster than they could be refilled. Herd animals weakened and died. Famine followed like a shadow. For palace economies already stressed by war and trade disruptions, this was a blow they could not absorb. Imagine the crisis through the eyes of a Hittite official. He sends scribes across the countryside to record crop yields. Each report is worse than the last. Villages beg for grain shipments from the capital. Merchants bring news of food shortages spreading across the empire. Vassal states cannot pay their taxes. Relief caravans are ambushed on the roads. The empire's reserves dwindle. Even the royal granaries shrink to dangerous levels. The Hittite king writes desperate letters to Egypt, pleading for grain. He frames the request in the language of diplomacy and friendship, but beneath the politeness lies a stark truth. The empire is starving. Egypt, with the Nile's relatively stable flooding, may have been one of the few regions still producing substantial grain. Yet even in Egypt, the inscriptions speak of hardship, of Libyan incursions, of shortages, of a pharaoh struggling to hold the edges of his kingdom together. The drought did not simply wither crops. It destabilized everything. Where food shortages grow, unrest follows. Where unrest grows, central authority weakens. Where authority weakens, borders crumble. Defense falters, trade collapses, people flee, armies disband. In this sense, drought was not the cause of the collapse, but the spark that ignited a chain reaction. This was not merely environmental change, it was environmental shock, and it was not limited to one region. Across the entire Mediterranean, dust storms increased, rivers shrank, forests receded. Archaeological layers show abandoned farms, eroded soils, and settlements shrinking in size. In Cyprus, an island that once thrived on copper production, many inland sites were simply deserted. Some scholars believe the drought was triggered by shifts in atmospheric circulation, the same kinds of shifts that cause modern megadroughts. Others argue volcanic activity or changes in sea temperatures contributed. Whatever the cause, the effect was widespread and profound. But climate alone cannot explain everything. After all, droughts had occurred before without causing complete societal collapse. So why did this drought prove so devastating? The answer lies in timing. The Bronze Age world had become deeply interconnected, dependent on complex trade networks, specialized labor, and administrative systems. When the environment turned hostile, this system lacked flexibility. A small kingdom might adapt to drought by shifting crops or consolidating resources, but an empire that controlled thousands of square miles and supported massive urban populations could not easily pivot. In good times, interconnectedness is a strength. In bad times, it becomes a weakness. And the drought fed into other crises: warfare, migration, economic breakdown, political upheaval, amplifying their effects. Across the Aegean, evidence suggests that forests were overharvested, reducing the ability to build ships or fuel bronze production. Soil exhaustion made fields less resilient to drought. The very success of the Bronze Age system had pushed environmental limits. When the climate shifted, the margins for survival disappeared. In some regions, famine sparked internal conflict. Palace records in the Levant mention grain theft, banditry, and rebellion. In others, famine drove migrations, entire communities abandoning their homelands in search of food and safety. One can imagine a family leaving their village in northern Syria. Their fields have failed 3 years in a row. They have sold their tools, their animals, their furniture. Now, with only what they can carry, they join others on the road, a stream of desperate humanity heading south toward the coast or west toward richer lands. They do not think of themselves as part of a collapse. They are simply trying to survive. In this vast movement of peoples, the boundaries between cause and effect blur. Did famine drive migration? Did migration cause conflict? Did conflict disrupt trade? Or did disrupted trade intensify famine? The truth is that all these forces fed into one another, creating a storm that no single empire could weather. But while climate change devastated much of the region, not all areas suffered equally. Some regions adapted quickly, others were buffered by geography, and still others found opportunities in the chaos. The Phoenician cities, for example Byblos, Sidon, Tyre, show signs of continuity and even growth. Their coastal location allowed them to retain access to maritime resources. Their economies were less dependent on inland agriculture and more flexible in trade. They became survivors not because they were immune to climate change, but because their systems were resilient. This pattern offers an important insight. Collapses do not affect all societies equally. Some fall, some endure, some transform. So as the drought tightened its grip on the Bronze Age world, the stage was set for a new question, one that historians still debate. How much of the collapse was driven by nature, and how much by human decisions? And to explore that question fully, we must now examine the political and economic systems of the Late Bronze Age, the palatial world itself, and why its intricate structure made it both powerful and vulnerable. To understand why the Bronze Age collapse was so total, so sweeping, so irreversible, we must turn our attention to the systems that held that world together. The palatial economies of the Late Bronze Age were marvels of organization and complexity. They marshaled resources on a scale unmatched for centuries afterward. They built bureaucracies that monitored every shipment, every field, every herd, every worker. They maintained diplomatic networks spanning thousands of miles, linking kings through letters, marriages, gifts, and treaties. They were sophisticated. They were powerful. They were impressive. But they were also fragile. Let us examine why. First, the Late Bronze Age kingdoms relied heavily on top-down command economies. Grain, wool, oil, metals, and manufactured goods were produced by farmers, herders, and artisans, then collected and redistributed by the palace. Bureaucrats tracked every detail on clay tablets. Scribes recorded shipments, labor assignments, and rations. Taxes flowed into storerooms. Food flowed out to workers, soldiers, and officials. This system functioned beautifully as long as everything worked, but it had a fatal flaw. It lacked elasticity. If harvest shrank even slightly, the palace lost surplus. If trade routes faltered, raw materials vanished. If a single region rebelled, it disrupted the entire supply chain. If the bureaucracy collapsed, the economy collapsed with it. Without the palace, society itself struggled to function. Consider the Mycenaeans. Their palaces, the likes of Pylos, Mycenae, Tiryns, were not just royal residences. They were the heart of economic life. They controlled pottery production, textile workshops, bronze foundries, and grain distribution. The palace did not simply supervise the economy, it was the economy. When these palaces burned, the entire system collapsed instantly, like a machine suddenly deprived of power. Without administrators to coordinate labor, without scribes to track supplies, without officials to collect taxes, the complex network that had supported thousands of people disintegrated. Cities depopulated, trade halted, knowledge evaporated, and so the mightiest political structures of the age turned out to be its most vulnerable. The Hittite Empire suffered similar weaknesses. Hattusa was a city built on administrative skill, not agricultural abundance. It was located in a dry interior region and depended heavily on grain imports from its vassals. When drought struck and vassals stopped paying tribute, the empire found itself starving. Its massive archives reveal constant requests for grain, shipments of emergency supplies, and royal decrees ordering food redistribution. It was a system stretched to the breaking point. When war, famine, and migration hit simultaneously, the Hittite administrative web snapped. We must also consider the economic fragility built into the very technology that defined the age. Bronze. Bronze required copper and tin. Copper was relatively available, but tin was not. The entire eastern Mediterranean depended on a handful of tin sources located hundreds or thousands of miles away. Without tin, no bronze tools, weapons, or ceremonial objects could be produced. A single disrupted trade route could choke off an empire's supply of metal, and that appears to be exactly what happened. Archaeological evidence shows that late in the Bronze Age, tin shipments declined sharply. Black markets arose. Bronze quality deteriorated. Some workshops were abandoned. When war broke out, kingdoms could no longer equip large armies with high-quality bronze weapons. This economic vulnerability created a cascading effect. Less tin meant fewer weapons. Fewer weapons meant weaker armies. Weaker armies meant rebels, invaders, and raiders could strike more easily. More strikes meant more interrupted trade. Interrupted trade meant even less tin. The entire system was caught in a downward spiral. Trade networks were the arteries of the Bronze Age, and once they clogged, the lifeblood of empires stopped flowing. But perhaps the most overlooked vulnerability of all was ideological. The Bronze Age world was built on hierarchy. Kings presented themselves not just as rulers, but as divine or semi-divine figures chosen by the gods. Their power rested on the belief that their rule was sacred, stable, and eternal. When famine spread, when enemies advanced, when palaces burned, subjects who once obeyed without question began to doubt. Doubt led to unrest. Unrest led to rebellion. In some cities, archaeological layers show signs of internal destruction. Palaces burned from the inside, weapons left scattered near storerooms, gates opened to invaders. These are not the marks of external conquerors, but of populations rebelling against rulers who could no longer meet their needs. This internal collapse reveals a simple, powerful truth. When a system fails, people stop believing in it. The Late Bronze Age was a world where trust in rulers, in trade, in diplomacy, in the gods held everything together. When that trust eroded, the political order dissolved. And yet, even as the palatial world crumbled, something new was emerging. The collapse did not create a vacuum, it created opportunity. In the absence of large kingdoms, smaller entities took shape. Local chiefs gained power. Merchants rose to prominence. Communities governed themselves. The rigid hierarchies of the Bronze Age gave way to more flexible, decentralized structures. These were the fertile grounds from which Iron Age city-states, kingdoms, and empires would rise. But before these new societies could flourish, they had to navigate a transitional age, a period defined by disorder, resilience, and reinvention. To understand that transition, we must explore the archaeological footprints left behind in the wake of the collapse. Abandoned ports, hastily fortified hilltops, new settlement patterns, and shifts in material culture that reveal how ordinary people adapted to a world in turmoil. And so we now turn to the question, what did everyday life look like during the collapse? How did villagers, artisans, sailors, and farmers survive when the world around them fell apart? The desert did not keep secrets forever. As the centuries passed, new travelers, Greek, Roman, Arab, crossed the same wastelands Cambyses once challenged. And in their writings, we begin to detect faint echoes of something out of place. Strange ruins deep in Egypt's western desert. These fragments, at first ignored, began to sharpen into something recognizable only when archaeology matured as a science. By the late 20th century, explorers and desert geologists returned to Herodotus's tale not as legend, but as a hypothesis. And then, a breakthrough. In 1996, a team surveying the remote sands around Dakhla Oasis reported curious metallic shapes protruding from the dunes. At first, they assumed they were modern scrap. But the closer they looked, the stranger. The pieces became bronze arrowheads, fragments of scale armor, and broken wooden shafts, desiccated yet unmistakably ancient. Nothing conclusive, but enough to set the archaeological world buzzing. The real turning point arrived in the early 2000s, when deep remote field teams began using satellite imaging to map irregular dune formations across Egypt's empty quarter. These were no random ripples. Hidden beneath were disturbed layers of sediment, stretching for kilometers, patterns consistent with a large human movement halted abruptly, as if by catastrophe. And soon after, the desert began to give up its dead. Human remains, sun-mummified, sand-encrusted, lay scattered across vast stretches of the western desert. Weapons fused to bone, jewelry ripped from bodies by time, leather sandals perfectly preserved by the Sahara's merciless dryness. And among them, Persian Achaemenid equipment, unmistakable in design. Not enough to reconstruct the whole army, but enough to finally whisper, something terrible happened out here. Yet even this didn't explain how. So researchers turned to the environment itself. Ancient desert climate models revealed a chilling truth. The Sahara of 525 BCE was not today's desert. It was transitioning, shifting unpredictably between periods of violent sandstorms and scorching calm. A traveler at the wrong moment could be swallowed whole by a sandstorm so immense it was described by ancient Egyptians as the sky becoming stone. Imagine it. 50,000 soldiers, stretched in a long, open column. No landmarks, no shelter, and suddenly, horizon turning black, wind screaming like a deity betrayed, the storm rising so tall it blotted out the sun. To the Persians, who believed Ahura Mazda governed cosmic order, this would not simply be weather, it would be divine judgment. Sand ripping through flesh, tents exploded from the ground, horses blinded instantly, men suffocating as dunes rose around them like a living ocean, an entire army frozen in panic as the world itself disappeared behind a curtain of sand. Not in minutes, not even hours, but in a storm that could have lasted days. When it finally ended, nothing remained. No trail, no bodies visible, No sign that 50,000 souls had once walked there. Just silence. And afterwards, the desert continued its slow burial, layer after layer, until only the memory survived first in the terrified whispers of witnesses. But the story doesn't end with tragedy. It ends with a warning, because Cambyses' lost army stands as a testament to how fragile even the greatest empires truly are. The Achaemenids ruled from Anatolia to the Indus. They built roads, palaces, and systems of governance unmatched for centuries. But even they could not overcome the merciless indifference of nature. The desert showed no favor, gave no mercy, and demanded no explanation. It simply erased, and in doing so, carved a mystery so enduring that even today, 25 centuries later, we still chase its final answer across scorched dunes, scattered bones, and the whispered echoes of an army swallowed whole. But there is one more layer to this mystery, one often overlooked, yet perhaps the most revealing of all. Because long before Cambyses sent his army into the dunes, the desert already had a reputation among the Egyptians. They called it the Red Land, a realm not meant for mortals. It was the domain of Set, the god of chaos, storms, and violent disorder. Every traveler, every caravan master, every priest knew the truth. The desert was alive, not in a mystical sense, but in a real, brutal, physical way. It shifted, it consumed, it transformed. It could reshape history without leaving a trace. And Cambyses? He ignored every warning. The Egyptian priests reportedly told him that no army had ever crossed that region without death nipping at its heels. The locals refused to guide his troops past certain boundaries. Merchants insisted the sands behaved strangely during particular seasons, twisting the sky into a blinding white shroud. But Cambyses, hardened by conquest and driven by visions of divine destiny, dismissed all of it as superstition. He saw the desert not as an adversary, but as an obstacle, something to be overcome by sheer imperial will. Yet perhaps the greatest irony is this. His target, the oasis city of Siwa, home of the Oracle of Amun, was not a military stronghold. It was a spiritual center, a place where mystical legitimacy was granted or denied. Cambyses wanted that legitimacy. He wanted the oracle to proclaim him the rightful ruler of Egypt, just as it had once blessed Alexander the Great. But marching an entire army simply to demand a prophecy? It was strategic arrogance on a scale rarely seen. And so the Persian soldiers, immaculate in formation, disciplined, loyal, marched into a landscape that didn't care who they were. Step by step, they left the realm of empire and entered the realm of chaos. Some scholars believe the troops never even made it halfway, that they splintered early, losing cohesion as sand erased their trail, as supply lines collapsed, as wells dried faster than anticipated. Others theorize that the army might have been ambushed not by Egyptians or rebels, but by rival desert tribes who understood the terrain better than any imperial general. But the most haunting possibility is the simplest. They died in isolation, in silence, unseen by any enemy, undone only by the planet itself. It wasn't warfare. It wasn't sabotage. It wasn't betrayal. It was nature's absolute superiority over human ambition. And centuries later, the desert itself began to show remorse or perhaps curiosity, revealing fragments of what it once swallowed. A bronze dagger hilt here, a shattered amphora there, cloth preserved for millennia, human remains twisted by desperation, faces fixed in expressions no storm could erase. These silent witnesses tell us that Cambyses' army did not simply vanish. They suffered, they struggled, they fought to survive until the very last breath. And their final march, once a symbol of imperial power, became a monument to human vulnerability. But if this is where the story should end, why does it still fascinate us? Why does the lost army of Cambyses continue to grip historians, explorers, and filmmakers alike? Because it embodies the eternal conflict between mankind and the unknown. We live in an age of satellites, GPS, and digital maps so detailed they can identify individual rocks. Where exactly does the army rest? Somewhere under hundreds of meters of shifting dunes, Their final campsite still exists, perfectly preserved, untouched, locked away from human eyes. A time capsule of an empire's greatest miscalculation. And the desert, patient as always, waits. In the end, the Bronze Age collapse stands as one of the most profound turning points in all of human history. An era when the great powers of the ancient world, kingdoms that had stood for centuries, fell not to a single enemy, but to a perfect storm of pressures no civilization could fully withstand. For more than 300 years, the Late Bronze Age connected the Mediterranean and Near East through a web of diplomacy, trade, and shared prosperity. Egypt, the Hittites, Mycenae, Canaan, each was a pillar supporting a vast international system. They exchanged copper and tin, gold and grain, letters and marriages, armies and ideas. They believed their world was permanent, but their foundations were fragile. Climate shifts dried out farmlands. Famine spread across entire regions. Earthquakes struck cities, already weakened by overextension. Internal rebellion simmered in the countryside. Trade routes faltered, and unknown waves of migrants and raiders, the people we now call the Sea Peoples, arrived at the worst possible moment, pushing already struggling kingdoms past the breaking point. No single factor ended the Bronze Age. It was the convergence of all of them at once. Systems that had grown too interconnected collapsed like dominoes. When trade stopped, bronze production halted. When bronze disappeared, weapons and tools declined in quality. Armies grew weaker. Cities became vulnerable. Communication lines broke. And the powerful empires that once traded gifts and threats with one another fell silent, one after another. By 1150 BCE, and confidence had been reduced to isolated towns fighting simply to survive. Writing disappeared from some regions. Palaces burned to their foundations. Populations shrank. Knowledge was lost. Yet this collapse was not merely an ending, it was a beginning. Out of the ashes emerged new peoples, new languages, new ideas. The Phoenicians rose to dominate Mediterranean trade. The Israelites formed their early kingdoms. Greek culture slowly reorganized itself and, centuries later, ignited the classical age. Even ironworking, once marginal, became the foundation of a new technological era. The Bronze Age collapse was a catastrophe, but it was also the event that cleared the stage for the world we know. And perhaps the greatest lesson it leaves us is this: civilizations don't fall simply because they are attacked. They fall when every part of their system strains at once, when crises overlap, when stresses accumulate silently over generations, until one day, a spark hits a dry landscape, and the entire structure gives way. The Late Bronze Age did not collapse because it was weak. It collapsed because it was complex. And in that complexity, we find a mirror of our own world, interconnected, interdependent, astonishingly advanced, and still vulnerable to the same forces of climate, economy, conflict, and instability. The Bronze Age reminds us that history is never guaranteed, that even the strongest systems can fail.